Now, where does the rubber come from? And the cobalt from your phones, where does this come from? Straight out of the earth of Africa. Titanium, aluminum, copper, silver, rubies, diamonds, rice, yams, coffee, cocoa, and even the plants used by America to produce the medicines. All of this comes straight out of the earth of Africa. So we see maybe Africa has some significant role in the world, in the function of the world, and even in our everyday lives. Now, the second question that I would like to pose is this: why the African people? What is so special about the African people that we will be taken everywhere around the four corners of the earth to work for someone else? Well, I'm glad you asked. Pick a sport, any sport. All it took was one of us, and when we entered the arena, we changed the entirety of the game. Let's look at Jackie Robinson in baseball, Wilt Chamberlain in basketball, Tiger Woods in golf, Venus and Serena Williams in tennis, and we just don't do hockey. And that's by choice. It's too cold for us. And we don't swim either because we have ancestral memories of our loved ones being thrown off of slave ships. Take a look in the field of medicine, and you'll find the first successful heart surgery in America was done by Daniel Hale Williams, a black man, in 1893. And the first people recorded in history to perform heart surgery are the ancient Egyptians, black people. Black people performing heart surgery 6,000 years ago. We must have had it good in Africa. Heart surgery and pyramids, geometrically in precision with the stars. We've had this for thousands of years. Give yourselves a black hand. You did that. Science, math, language, arts, it has all come from you. It all came from Africa, and because we are Africans, we are the first owners of the great knowledge and wisdom of the universe, and every nation had to first learn from us. So why the Africans? Because black don't crack. The red man and woman, which are our Native American brothers and sisters, were colonized and tortured and subjugated to forced labor. And you can barely find a Native American today. The black man and woman was reduced to the same treatment of the red man, and they intensified the torture, and they made us work harder and longer. And we're still here. You can get tired of black folk, leave the West End, move all the way out to the East End, and you're still gonna run into black folk. We are everywhere, everywhere. Because we don't die.
We multiply.
And so, we can understand the significance of enslaving black people. Certainly, we are a people with the longest history in the world, and our history does not begin in chains and on slave ships. We all know that we were kings and queens in Africa, and we still are kings and queens. We just have to get back on our throne.
Amen. Woo, yes.
We built the first castles and the first pyramids. There are castles all throughout Ethiopia. And Egypt is not the only African country with pyramids. Sudan, an African country, has hundreds of pyramids, as well as Ethiopia. Egypt, which is an African country, has had the longest lasting empire in history, with a history spanning for thousands of years. In fact, for thousands of years, the Egyptian empire included all of Africa and Asia. So, all of Africa and Asia was a part of the Egyptian empire. So you can even today see a man from Libya in North Africa and he looks just like a man from Iraq in West Asia. And a woman from Ethiopia in East Africa looks just like a woman from India in Central Asia. Egypt was so prominent that Abraham camped in Egypt. And when there was a famine in the land of Jacob, the Israelites turned to Egypt for help. Now, something occurred during the time of Moses and during the time of Joseph and Moses, where the original rulers of Egypt were overthrown by invaders called the Hittites, and Moses had to lead his people to freedom. After this period, the original Egyptians regained their throne, and Egypt and Israel became allied nations again. If we study our history, or our story, we will find that there was a black nation from West Africa who ruled Western Europe. These blacks are called the Moors. The term Moor is a Latin word for black. So these black Moors went into Europe through Spain and became the rulers of Western Europe. From Spain up to Britain and over to Italy.
Spain to Britain and over to Italy.
Based in Spain from 711 AD to 1492, the Moors ruled in Western Europe. It was these Africans known as the Moors who brought Europe out of the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages in Europe lasted from about 476 AD to about 800 AD, and is a time with no recorded history in Europe, a time where war, famine, and disease plagued Europe, and it was the Africans who cured the land. Now, we're going to put a pin here and save this date, and we'll return to the Moors in a moment, because the ball really gets to rolling by 1492. So, over on the other side of Europe, it was another black nation called the Ottoman Empire, who ruled in Eastern Europe. Based in Turkey, the Ottomans ruled Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa from 1299 to 1923. And it wasn't until World War I that the Ottomans were defeated and their lands distributed to the European power structure. Now, we'll put a pin on this date and return to the Ottomans. So, back to the black Moors in Western Europe. As the Moors developed Europe, some of the European groups decided that they didn't want blacks in their countries teaching them. So they said, "Sorry, Joe, you got to go." And they began kicking the Moors out of Europe, starting in Britain in 1292. They pushed the Moors out of Spain and back to West Africa by 1492. 200 years were spent pushing the Moors out of Europe, from 711 to 1492. So we'll say 700 to 1500. 800 years where we were the rulers of Western Europe. And when was the European Renaissance? The 1500s. So that classical music was written by you, oh African people. We created every style of music. Classical, blues, jazz, gospel, rock and roll, hip hop. We must be some great and amazing people. Give yourselves a black hand. Even the Greeks didn't have a history until Alexander the Great walked into Egypt and took philosophy, math, and science to Greece in 332 BC. Again, we are the first people who held the great knowledge on this earth, and every nation first learned from us. Now, in the 1400s, as the Europeans were kicking the Africans out of Europe, the Europeans went into West Africa, which is just below Spain. It was in West Africa where the Europeans learned how to build ships, and in West Africa where the Europeans got maps of how to navigate the Atlantic Ocean. In 1452, Spain took a group of about 12 Africans to Italy to serve the Roman Catholic Pope, Pope Nicholas V. And in 1452, Pope Nicholas V sanctioned the transatlantic slave trade. So, after getting kicked out of Europe, We were then taken out of Africa and sold back to Europe as slaves. I've asked myself many times again, how could they just take us from our lands? Well, we were not slaves when we got onto the Spanish and Portuguese ships. In the beginning of the slave trade, we were lured onto the ships. The slave ports were not on the continent of Africa. They were on islands just off the coast of Africa. Let me ask you, how much do we know about the Bahamas and about Cuba today? With all of this advanced technology, we still know very little, if anything, about the islands that are just below America. And so what must it have been like 500 years ago with the slave ports in Africa? I visited a slave port in West Africa called Gore Island, just off of the coast of Senegal. Our blood is still on the walls. At Gore Island, the Europeans had a door called the Door of No Return. It was called this because they never wanted us to return after walking through this door. I returned, and it was an amazing experience. Some of us were lured onto the ships, and other of us were kidnapped. From the boat, we were taken to the islands where no one could hear our cries and no one could look to find us. While on these islands, we were brutalized, and they tried to beat us into submission. Then they pushed us through the door of no return and onto the slave ships. What they refused to acknowledge in the history books is that we fought for our freedom from day one. There were times where we captured the ship, turned it around, and set sail back to Africa. And there were other times where we sank the ships because we said, better to drown in the ocean than to be enslaved to another man. And so we fought when we were dragged out of Africa, and we fought when we were dragged onto the slave ships, and we fought when we were dragged onto the shores of America. From 1452, when slavery was sanctioned, until 1886, when the last country in the Americas was liberated, we fought. No one gave us freedom. We took it. We said until we are free, no one will sleep easy at night. There are over 500 slave revolts recorded during the transatlantic slave trade. Imagine how many they did not record. And even so, that's 500 slave revolts over the course of 500 years. So that's one revolt every year. And so here we are, 1492. By 1492, the Moors were completely kicked out of Europe and then sold back to Europe as slaves. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. Again, by 1492, the Moors were completely kicked out of Europe and then sold back to Europe as slaves. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. Christopher Columbus learned to build ships in West Africa, then took Africans across the Atlantic Ocean and to the Americas with maps he had acquired in Africa. And now the ball really gets to rolling. 430 years we were enslaved, from 1452, when we were taken off the shores of West Africa, until 1886, when the last country in the Americas freed themselves. The first African nation to free themselves was a Caribbean island in 1803, which was renamed Haiti, or Hell, the living dead, zombies. This is what they refer to us when we free ourselves. Hell-bound zombies. From 1803 to the 1880s, all of the Caribbean islands freed themselves. We freed ourselves here in the United States in 1865, and the last country to free themselves in the Americas was Brazil in 1886 in South America. 430 years we were enslaved, just as the Israelites, oppressed for 430 years by a foreign ruler. And our wilderness period has lasted for 150 years. Next year, 2015, marks 150 years of freedom for the African Americans. From 1865 to 2015 is 100.